The subtitle of this is Ontologist Leaving the Philosophical Mothership. And if you go to Wikipedia, it used to have a page called Barry Smith Philosopher. Now it has a redirect page, which points to Barry Smith Ontologist. I gave a talk with this title in October of 2006, and I didn't have an abstract for my talk then. I had this picture, which is a picture of a gleaming white ship called HMS Ontology steaming out of some dirty old Mediterranean harbor. Unfortunately, I realized only later that the ship is actually steaming towards the harbor. But never mind. So the idea is that philosophy, over time, has repeatedly seen the birth of new disciplines, which start off as philosophy and then gradually acquire their own independence. And this has happened already multiple times. And it's happening now with ontology. And this meeting is part of the process, painful process, of the birth of a new discipline. And I'm going to start with a preamble about 19th century psychology, how they succeeded in leaving the philosophical mothership, because they did succeed in leaving the philosophical mothership. I don't think psychology is yet the most glistening, brilliant discipline in the pantheon of sciences, but it's still an independent discipline with its own buildings and so forth. Now, one of the most important figures in the invention of psychology as a discipline was Brentano, who we've already met. And Brentano's motto was that the true method of philosophy is none other than the method of the natural sciences. And he tried to demonstrate this by developing a scientific, empirical way of doing philosophy. It was very Aristotelian in complicated ways, which I don't need to go into here, but it was also very influential and led amongst many of his students to a truly scientific approach to philosophy, which created in the Austrian Empire, where Brentano was a serious philosophical figure of power, it created a scientific mode of doing philosophy. So one of the reasons why the Vienna Circle, which was a very science-friendly philosophical movement, was created in Vienna and not in Königsberg or some other Soviet town, was because of Brentano, who was a professor in Vienna and who taught generations of very important figures. Brentano's influence was particularly strong in Poland, or in those parts of Poland which were part of the Austrian Empire at that time, particularly Lemberg or Lwów, which was the heart of Polish scientific philosophy, which was a very important philosophical tradition in the 20th century, and one of the sources of some of the most important work in logic in the 20th century. Now, in 1874, Brentano published his masterpiece, Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint, the motto of which is that psychology is the hub and angle point of philosophy. The way to do philosophy is to do psychology in an empirical way, in this Brentano's understanding of empirical, which is not experimental. And I don't want to go into the details of the difference, but you can compare Brentano's understanding of empirical to the understanding of empirical which John Stuart Mill embraced. And when I say that Brentano was influenced by Aristotle, Brentano thought that by empirical means you could discover universals in something like the Aristotelian sense. But the most important figure, I'm sad to say, and because it should be Brentano, in the foundation of modern psychology is a German psychologist by the name of Wilhelm Wundt, who established the world's first psychological laboratory in the University of Leipzig in 1879. And that is a great achievement. So, it proved to be the beginning of something big and lasting and important. Rather quickly, I think primarily motivated by people who studied with Wundt, the first laboratory of psychology in America was established at Johns Hopkins. that Germany was the center of this movement, but America was very quickly following in Wundt's footsteps. And in the same year, Wundt's laboratory gets official recognition from the university authorities. And also one of Brentano's students, by the name of Karl Stumpf, publishes volume 1 of a big book called Tone Psychology, or the Psychology of Sound. And Wundt establishes a journal to publish the results of his laboratory of experimental psychology. And the journal is called Philosophical Studies. Now, that is indicative of the fact that even Wundt still thought that he was a philosopher. This is 4 years after establishing the world's first laboratory of experimental psychology. He didn't realize what he'd achieved yet, but he was on his way to establishing journals. In 1889, there was the first International Congress of Psychology, and the first laboratory of psychology in Austria-Hungary was founded by another student of Brentano's by the name of Alexius Meinong. And in the same year, the first Chinese translation of a Western psychology book was published, called Mental Philosophy. In 1892, the American Psychological Association was founded with 42 members, many of them either Germans or students who studied in Germany. In 1894, Stumpf was called to serve as professor of philosophy in Berlin, is the Reichshauptstadt, with the explicit task of establishing there an Institute of Psychology, which was a task which was given to him by the Ministry of Education as an official government duty. And in Stumpf's Berlin Institute, the Gestalt Psychology movement was founded. And the Gestalt Psychology movement is important because they embraced the methods of experimental psychology, but they still saw themselves as doing work which was empirical philosophy, as did Stumpf and as did Brentano. And then there is a bit of German here, which I can't explain because this is a passage about Poland. But I'll read it anyway. Twardowski, ein weiterer Brentano-Schüler, gründete das erste psychologische Laboratorium in Polen, which means that Twardowski, who was a student of Brentano, founded the first psychological laboratory in Poland. That was in 1890. You can see Brentano's students were very active in this new burgeoning movement of psychology. And all of them, just like many initial members of the American Psychology Association, were professors of philosophy. So the American Psychological Association was founded by philosophers. And then the question arises, when was psychology born as a science? When did it free itself from the mothership? Now, in order to answer that question, we need to understand the reasons why one might want found a new discipline. So, you're doing philosophy in Germany. The spirit of Kant is still hovering. This is the era of skepticism and decline. The spirit of Kant is hovering, but even worse, the spirit of Hegel. Hegel's daughter, I believe, married the mathematician Weierstrass about this time. And Weierstrass had a plaque in his office for the sake of his wife, which read, "Hegel shall not be reviled in this office." That Hegel was truly embarrassing, and people who were doing real things like mathematics reviled Hegel. I nearly said Frege. And because philosophy in Germany in this period was in a dead end. They didn't have any interesting new results. They were just going around in circles. There were schools of sub-Kantian something who were fighting with other sub-Kantian schools of something else. And there were no methods. There was no clarity. You couldn't say whether anything was right or wrong. They claimed to be doing logic. And you would read what they were doing, and it seemed as if they might be doing anything. But at the same time, people like Wundt were developing new methods which seemed to be tackling at least some philosophical problems, for instance, about sensation. And with these empirical results, there came also an increasing intersection with other disciplines. For instance, the experimental results on the psychology of visual perception were intersecting with interesting results which were being discovered about the structure of the retina and about the optics, the physics of light. And a recognition on the part of those involved, particularly in the Brentano-influenced zones of Europe, which is to say Austria-Hungary, that philosophers should collaborate with scientists. And this was particularly evident in Vienna, but it was true in Poland also. And Stumpf was probably the most conscious of this need to recognize that philosophy had to collaborate much more closely with real science. And also, Stumpf was one of those people who was reviling Hegel. So one reason why German idealism failed, Stumpf wrote, was a matter of scientific organization. Philosophy became fixated on a single personality, which set fundamental barriers to mutual understanding, division of labor, mutual criticism and correction, and mutual recognition, and gave rise to a kind of dogmatic intolerance alien to science. Science, you see, rests on the principle of cooperation, and German philosophy rested on a principle of adulation. If you want to become a professor of philosophy in Germany, you have to write 2 dissertations, both of which have to be about Hegel, or about Kant and Hegel, or about Hegel and Kant, or Hegel, Kant, and Fichte. That is not a good method for doing great philosophy. There's Stumpf and said people like. And so more and more philosophers became interested in psychology. And there was a struggle for resources because there were only a limited number of philosophical chairs, professorships. And in Germany, being a philosophical professor is very, very close to being God. And because of all of these young philosophers becoming professors and not doing philosophy anymore, there was a reaction from within philosophy, which expressed itself in 1913 in a letter which was published in the main German newspapers, which was a declaration from the lecturers of philosophy in Germany against the occupation of philosophical chairs with representatives of experimental psychology. And Carnap has a remark in his autobiography which explains something of the mentality involved here. So if one is interested in relations between fields, which according to customary academic divisions belong to different departments, then he will not be welcomed as a builder of bridges, but will rather be regarded by both sides as an outsider and troublesome intruder. Here we have people who become outsiders and who are intruding into a not yet existing area, so they don't have friends anywhere. Now, inevitably, initially, the people representing the new discipline will be unsophisticated because the discipline doesn't exist. I feel unsophisticated because I'm working in a discipline which doesn't exist yet. And their work will be credit card numbers. How trivial can you get? The work of the new discipline will be regarded by the philosophical mother discipline as trivial. And there will be invented insulting names like psychologism or scientism or materialism in order to dismiss the new non-philosophical activities as being somehow mere ideology or as being somehow an ism rather than true philosophy. True philosophy is interested in the nature of absolute knowledge or the transcendental ego or something like that. The problem then is that these feelings of jealousy and dismissal on the part of the philosophers are are emphasized, exaggerated, intensified by the fact that the new discipline is beginning to require more resources than the old discipline. So the psychology conferences, which began to be held at the beginning of the century, began to be much bigger than the philosophical conferences which had been held earlier. And the resources that Stumpf had for his new laboratory in Berlin were orders of magnitude greater than the resources which were given to ordinary professors of ordinary philosophy in Germany at the same time. So this creates all kinds of jealousies. Now, it's that jealousy which plays a role in forcing the discipline to establish itself as a new discipline. Because there would be no problem in continuing to work as a philosopher, in continuing to do this psychological work within philosophy departments if the philosophers would just recognize there is this new branch of experimental philosophy. Philosophers don't do that because of these merely human motives having to do with things like struggle for survival and jealousy as concerns limited resources. All right, so now let's move. This is the history of the founding of psychology, and it gives us some idea of what's involved. Jealousy, conferences, world organizations, journals. Now let's look at ontology. So ontology began as a part of philosophy, so they tell me. I can't remember back so far. And it was sort of interrelated with metaphysics. So the metaphysics is sometimes called the science of being. Ontology, we might say, is the theory of the types of entities existing in reality and of the relations between these types. There are many other ways in which you define these things. But now we have ontologies in the technological or technical sense, which are the classification systems, tagging resources, controlled, structured, logical vocabularies, which I referred to at the beginning of this lecture series this morning. They are standardized systems for classifying and annotating data, which enable data to be integrated, particularly scientific data, but increasingly also other kinds of data, as we will see tomorrow. Now, this is becoming big business. So in 2004, if you looked in Google under ontology and Heidegger, you got a measly 58,000 hits. Aristotle was doing a little bit better, but still measlily. And ontology and philosophy altogether got 327,000 hits, but ontology and information systems got more than twice as much. Now, the figures today are astonishing. So ontology and Heidegger is really catching up. I think the reason then was that Heideggerians were just slow at learning about computers. But now they're catching up. They're still not quite up there with Aristotle, but they're pretty close. And ontology and philosophy is catching up. But ontology and information systems is still more than twice, right? It's nearly more than twice as represented as ontology and philosophy. And there's been an increase in the 5 years of about 15%. Is that right? Am I? Oh, it's much more than that. No, there's an increase of 1,500%. I'm not very good at. Anyway, it's a lot. 1,500% or something like that. Maybe someone can work it out for me. Probably 10 times. Okay, good. Except in the case of Heidegger and Aristotle, where that's 1,000%, right? And but in the case of Aristotle and Heidegger, it's much more than that. But that's just because they learned about computers in the last 5 years. And you can see, if you look at Google history, which I discovered by accident, so they're really good because they get the very first occurrence of the word ontologia in the philosophical literature, which was in 1604, which is the earliest I've been able to. The earliest I've been able to find had been 1613. So this is very interesting. But you can see the way in which ontology is growing. These things are always a little bit. There's a lag. So they always go down at the end, but then as time goes on, they continue to rise. So ontology has been going along, but in the last 40 years or so, it's been growing tremendously, and particularly since the beginning of this millennium, been growing even further. And this is illustrated also. Yes?
Sure. How do you know that these are actual signs of increased interest, or not just signs of more output since the information age? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes. So there are various different reasons why these measures might be less impressive than they seem. So more publications are being accessed on the internet, and Google, therefore, is catching these publications. I don't know how I can express this, but I know from my own experience that ontology is exploding just because of my own email track. And measuring, for instance, in people who are looking for ontologists to hire. For the first 25 years of my ontological activity, I never ever received a single email I didn't receive any emails most of that time, but never mind. I never received any kind of communication, not even a paper communication or a spoken communication from anybody saying, do you have a student we could hire? We need an ontologist. Now I get such requests almost daily. And I myself am making those requests to myself almost daily because I need people to do work. And other people are experiencing exactly the same immense exploding growth. And so I can tell you that there is something real underlying these data. I could talk a lot more about evidence that something real is real, but something that I feel is real. But you will see some more examples which will show that the case is pretty strong. So one case is illustrated in the fact that there are now quite significant resources for research in ontology. So there is a National Institutes of Health National Center for Biomedical Ontology, which has been funded by NIH roadmap money with $18.8 million, which has three cores or three members of the consortium, one of which is some Department of Philosophy, strangely. So clearly that should be a Department of Ontology, but we don't yet have any departments of ontology in the United States. And the goal of the National Center for Biomedical Ontology is to develop ontological resources to support biomedical research. And we've had that. And then there is the National Center for Ontological Research, which we founded here in Buffalo in 2005. And we established this to advance ontology as a science. So we were really trying to create the discipline to advance ontology education, to develop measures of quality for ontologies, to establish best practices. We initiated a quite successful conference series, which is still going on, called the Ontology for the Intelligence Community conferences. And we are now working for the Army net-centric data strategy, trying to build an ontology, not just for the Army, but for other parts of the federal government, which you will find out about tomorrow in the final session. And now we have ontology as a branch of philosophy. We have ontology as a technology. But what we're interested in really is ontology as a science. So I think that ontology is a little bit like statistics. You can't do science anymore without trained statistics help. And I believe increasingly scientists in many areas are discovering that you can't do science anymore without ontologists helping you to organize your data, to describe your data, to publish your data, to make your data compatible, reusable, comparable, integratable, capable of being reasoned with computationally and doing a lot of other things. You can't do that without help from people who are trained ontologists. If you're going to train ontologists, you need a science of ontology that they will be trained in. And that science of ontology has to be created. And the computer scientists have, unfortunately, not created it. They have instead created a whole series of technological artifacts which don't hang together. They are, each one is created as its own ad hoc response to a certain problem of a customer or a project. And there was no attempt to try and create principles, try and create methods for evaluating the quality, the correctness of an ontological representation. And so the need has to be met by some other means. Now, computer scientists will be involved in addressing this need, but we can't leave it to the computer scientists. And so we create ontology with the help of those people who used to be called philosophers. And so we're building ontologies in a scientific way rather than in a technological way. We're building ontologies using a scientific method which we are developing step by step to address successive challenges. And most of the work so far has been in the area of biomedicine. So these are just some of the projects which have been funded by the NIH in the realm of biomedical ontology. There are many more now, but these are some of the more interesting ones. There is also funding from the NIH for research in ontology science. So our friend Dr. Koistas in the middle of the room is funded to study how you evaluate ontologies. And we have colleagues in Seattle who are studying how you combine ontologies in a coherent way and how you create views of ontologies which can be useful for specific practical purposes. But they are not funded to build ontologies. They are funded to study ontological methods in a scientific way. And then we have something called the Obo Foundry Project, which is a project by scientists, some of whom are biologists, some of whom are computer scientists, some of whom are people like me. We are trying to develop a set of principles and best practices for ontology development and to realize them by building ontologies which satisfy these principles and which thereby work together as a single consistent suite extending over the whole of biological and biomedical reality. So OBO means open biomedical ontologies. And this is a small fragment of the OBO kingdom. So you can see that we have ontologies at the molecular level. We have chemistry ontologies. We have molecular function, molecular process, cellular process, organism level process, phenotypic quality, anatomy, cellular anatomy, cell type, organism type, and so forth. And this template here is organized in accordance with the Buffo ontology, which I showed you at the very end of the first lecture, and which we will come back to later on. And if you're going to do the ontology of anatomy correctly, then of course you need to recognize that there are not only material parts of the anatomy, but also wholes. There are both parts and wholes, where the wholes here have an H. And that means that you need more than the resources of Aristotelian substance accident ontology. You also need some of these other things that I talked about under the heading of Aristotle 2.10. So we need to address questions like what is a whole if we're going to do the ontology of biology in any kind of coherent way, even for the simplest part of the ontology of biology, which is the anatomical part. But then we also need to address questions like what is a system? So a complex organism like the human organism involves many bodily systems. And Aristotle and Kant never ever thought about the question, what is a bodily system? And it's actually a very difficult question. And this is another kind of system. This is the thing about cars, but it's something in a car. The interesting thing is that some of these systems, of course, connect up with other systems. So this thing, if it isn't the electrical system, probably isn't, connects to the electrical system in your car. And this thing, well, this is an illustration of the way in which different systems are connected together with other systems, which is even more complicated when we're talking about the ways in which the nervous system within the body, for instance, connects up with the other systems in the body, regulating these other systems, because that raises the next question: what is regulation? That's an ontological question. It's not a question which biologists are very good at answering at that level of granularity. They can describe in very great detail specific ways in which parts of the body regulate other parts, but they can't give you a good definition of regulation. And then if we think about systems and we think about body parts which are parts of those systems and functioning parts of those systems, for instance, the heart as part of the cardiovascular system, then we have to think about functions. Well, what is a function? We have to think about the fact that anything which has a function can also malfunction. And that brings then the questions like, what is disease and what is death? So even the question, what is death, is ontologically speaking not trivial. And so we need to extend Aristotle to include not just wholes, but also systems, networks of systems, functions, malfunctions. And then we need to think about pathways, which is a term increasingly used by biologists at different levels. So this is molecular pathways. What is a pathway? Again, biologists are very good at describing specific pathways, but if you ask them what is a pathway, they will say things like, a pathway is a representation of a pathway. And that is not a very good answer to the question, what is a pathway? They don't even see why it's a problem very often. Now, going back to philosophy just for 1 minute, there is a famous slogan that philosophers tell philosophy students. The philosophers sometimes do what is called a philosophy of science. And philosophers, when they do the philosophy of science, are very careful to say that they're not trying to interfere with the way scientists do their work. Scientists do their work, and the philosopher's job is to look at what they're doing and try to understand the concepts involved, or what is evidence, what is knowledge, what is scientific knowledge, those kinds of questions you can ask. But you're not allowed to say that one particular group of scientists should change and do something else. Now, I think that slogan has to be eliminated. Not that the philosophers should interfere with science, but ontologists are increasingly going to have to interfere with science. And the reason is that if they don't do it, then computer scientists will do it, and computer scientists will make a mess. Science increasingly requires computational resources. You can't do science in the modern age without using computers, because the amounts of data that scientists face are so huge that they can't be coped with by unaided human resources. And so computer scientists build models for that. And these models are simplified representations of what the computer scientist thinks is going on within the corresponding scientific theory. And they are based on a very strange computer science technology of model building. And the result is, as I could prove ad nauseam, you gave me another 10 hours, a lot of problematic stuff.
You've said several times that, and I've heard in other places too, that computer science fundamentally has not understood how to organize the information correctly. What's the fundamental cause behind that?
I'm tempted to say that they do know how to organize this information correctly, but they have an interest. Actually, I don't want to be rude now, so I'll be very careful. Some of them have an interest in not doing it properly, because then people come back for more money or with more money. I don't want to be rude about Microsoft, but some people have argued that Microsoft is deliberately not writing good operating system software, but rather writing operating system software which will continually need to be revised, because then they make a lot more money. And I'm not sure whether that's fair, but I can understand the motives involved. I mean, I'm not sure whether that's true of Microsoft. Another argument, which is along the same vein, is that computer scientists are trained to build tools for specific jobs. They're not trained to build tools which will work with other tools, and they're not trained to tell a customer, you don't need to give me money because you can use a tool which already exists, and then you'll have the advantage of interoperability with what these other people are doing. And that's what we need to tell people. We need to tell people that you shouldn't build a tool here because we already have one which was created in San Diego. And shall I continue, or does that give you I think that they would know better, but that they have an interest in doing it in a local way rather than in working out how to do it properly in a global way. All right, so I think that ontologists will necessarily interfere with the positive sciences in the future because ontology and information management in the correct way is going to be a necessary part of science. So they will not be interfering with science, they will be part of the scientific activity itself, in just the same way that statisticians are. Now, another feature of ontology in the technical sense, the engineering sense, is that there are intellectual confusions which underlie this activity called information modeling or conceptual modeling. And most of these confusions have to do with the confusion of use and mention. So when I say I never use the word concept, then I am not using the word concept, I am mentioning it. But in computer science, there is actually a methodology which involves ignoring the distinction between use and mention. So ignoring, in other words, the distinction between swimming is healthy and swimming has 8 letters. The first sentence is about swimming. The second sentence is about swimming. It's useful to model swimming in your computer with swimming. So you put swimming in your computer and you think that that's a model of swimming. And very quickly, you start to make mistakes. And one classic representation of these mistakes is illustrated by this quote from Tom Gruber, who is one of the very first ontologists. For AI systems, he says, what exists, in near quote, is what can be represented. This is an illustration of the use mentioned. Another illustration is Microsoft Health Vault in its definition of analogy episode. An analogy episode is a single unit of data that is recorded in Microsoft Health Vault. Now, that is not a good definition of analogy episode. And it certainly was no good 10 years ago when Microsoft Health Vault didn't exist. So ontology in the scientific sense, it's not a job for software engineers. But I don't think it's a job for philosophers either. I'll come back to that. But first of all, ontology has become a practical activity, which involves working with very practical people and addressing practical concerns which have nothing to do with philosophy. So the philosophical schooling is incompatible with the kinds of needs which ontologists increasingly face. And I'll come back to another series of reasons why ontology has to be freed from the philosophical knowledge. Let's go back to the reasons for founding a new discipline. So you found a new discipline when you feel that the old discipline has reached a dead end. Now, I find that the old discipline has reached a dead end. We've been talking about 3-dimensionalism versus 4-dimensionalism for what must be 100 years. We've been talking about whether the statue and the clay from which it is made are identical or not identical for 100 years. We've been talking about other philosophical problems for 1,000 or 2,000 years. And everybody knows who has worked on these problems that you can go either way. You can drive on the left or you can drive on the right. And you'll get equally good arguments on either side. At some point, certain decisions have to be made which are not going to be based on philosophical argument. They're going to be based on practical considerations, which will sometimes, to echo a theme which has manifested itself repeatedly in the discussions so far, will choose on the basis of something which is entirely arbitrary. It doesn't matter whether you drive on the left or the right. What matters is that everybody drives on the same eye. And there are examples in ontology, in the practically relevant sense, the scientific sense, which are just like driving on the right. And that's not a philosophically adequate methodology for making a determination of what your methodology should. We also have new kinds of empirical methods. Some methods in ontology work, some don't. Empirically, we discover that they don't work. And there are no such empirical methodologies within traditional philosophy. But then also, as will be clear from both today and from tomorrow's lectures, there are increasingly multiple ways in which ontologists need to collaborate with people in other disciplines. And therefore also, increasingly, there will be phenomena like multiple authorship. Most philosophical books and papers have single authors. This was a paper I published which has about 15 authors, actually more because one of the authors is a consortium. And this was another paper I published which has a similar number of authors, including this very same consortium. Actually, no, that's the same paper. This is another paper which has multiple authors. Now, some of these authors in both cases are also former philosophers. Some of them are logical database people. Some of them are bioinformatics engineers, scientists, and some of them are biologists, professors of genetics or anatomy. Now, by some measures, this paper is a contribution to the first order logic of relation, called Relations in Biomedical Ontologies, and it defines in recognizably logical terms relations like part of and is a and instantiates and so forth, which I described in the second lecture this morning, but with examples deriving from biology and with pointers to applications that biologists make in building ontologies. Now, interestingly, this article, which is available online, has been accessed 20,939 times, and it's accessed approximately 10 times a day. It's already 3 years old. Now that's, for a philosophical article, that kind of thing is impossible. It's been referenced, I think, 300 times in published papers. And again, for philosophy articles, that would be relatively, apart from Derrida. So, if you want to found a new discipline, what do you need? You need journals, conferences, institutes, societies, industrial applications, be relevant to the wider world, a subject matter, be nice, methods, cumulative results, and then most difficult, teaching and a career path. I think we have about 5 of these really well baked in the ground. You also need building. So we have a journal. It has an ugly, whatever that thing is, but we have a journal. Actually, we have multiple journals now. We have the Journal of Biomedical Semantics. We have the International Journal of Metadata Semantics and Ontologies. We have conferences. We have the International Conference on Formal Ontology in Information Systems, which has been, I think, held 6 times in different countries in the world. We had this year in Buffalo, the International Conference on Biomedical Ontology, which had some 200 participants coming from all over the world. You can find it online at icbo.buffalo.edu. We have the Ontology for the Intelligence Community, which I mentioned earlier. We have the Japanese Center for Ontological Research, which organizes the Japan Ontology Forum every year. We've had 3 of those. And now, interestingly, we have So the first formal ontology conference that I know of anyway was the International Workshop on Formal Ontology held in March 1993 in Padua by an organization called LADZEP, which we'll return to in a minute. Thomas Gruber, who we saw before, gave a very famous and very influential paper at this conference. So something very interesting started to happen already in 1993. The gene ontology, incidentally, was not invented until 1999. It held its 10th birthday this year. So we have research institutes. LADZEB is probably the world's first ontology research institute. And it's Italian for, I don't know where they get the L from, but I think that's laboratory. Institute for System Science and Biomedical Engineering, which formed in 1991 a research group on conceptual modeling, which is Italian for ontology, and knowledge engineering. And this was founded by a gentleman called Nicola Guarino, who is a doctor of engineering, who read some philosophy books. And on the history of this institute, LADZEB, it's pointed out that this group under Guarino gained an international reputation for its interdisciplinary approach. Focused, this is an engineer, a doctor of engineering from an Italian university, focused on the role of philosophical ontology in the foundations of knowledge representation. And then in 2003, Guarino's group moved to Trento to form the Laboratory for Applied Ontology. They're still not teaching, but they are building institutes. They even have a building. And they have a website, Laboratory for Applied Ontology. They have a journal. They now run the journal, Applied Ontology, along with Stanford, which it has a number of important ontologies. That's where the National Center for Biomedical Ontology is primarily based. They have their own top-level ontology, which is called Dolce, which is Italian for wheat. The night eight. So performs basic and applied research on the ontological foundations of blah blah. And then we have the Metaphysics Research Lab in Stanford, which unfortunately, while it does very interesting and I think clever work, is still really doing awesome with logical tools. Then we have Labont, which is the Laboratory for Ontology in Turin. So we have the Laboratory for Applied Ontology in Padua. We had in Trento and Rome. Actually, they have an outpost in Rome. We have a laboratory that we have the Padua LADZEB. We have the laboratory in Turin, and it's sometimes asked, why are there so many institutes of ontology in the north of Italy? This is raised by people in Sicily, and the answer that you get is that in the north of Italy they don't have pasta. So what can you do? No pasta, so you might as well do ontology. And then you have IFOMIT, which I founded in Germany in 2002, which is the Institute for Formal Ontology and Medical Information Science. And we have journals, conferences, we have societies, we have institutes, we have industrial applications. So there are companies with names like Ontology Works. There is a company called Ontology, which does aligns existing dirty data to provide a single joined-up view of customer services and network inventory. So it's a company called Ontology Systems. The slide doesn't reproduce very well, but it's all about aligning existing data. It looks beautiful on my screen, but here it looks. Then we have societies, learning societies. So there's the International Society for Biocuration, which is a society of people who spend their days, these are trained PhD biologists who spend their days tagging literature using terms from ontologies, and thereby also contributing to correcting and expanding and sometimes creating those ontologies. So curation, it means annotating literature. And there are hundreds of them. And they have their own career path and their journals and members and conferences. They have jobs. They have a mission. Then there is the International Association for Ontology and its Applications, which has a desperate appeal. Help us find a logo because this one is ugly. This is the same Italian logo person. So a non-profit organization, the purpose of which is to promote interdisciplinary research and international collaboration at the intersection of philosophical ontology, linguistics, logic, cognitive science, and computer science, as well as in the applications of ontological analysis, blah, blah. Now, so we have most of those things on the list, but we don't have a career path. We don't really have teaching in ontology. This is one of the very first such events, in my view. But we will have those things because the need is demonstrated overwhelming. And there are people in this room who are contributing to meeting that need already. So, typical reactions to the founding of a new discipline. There is a struggle for resources and resistance from within philosophy. I wonder why I put that slide there. Huh? Yes, ontology at Buffalo down there in small. Yes, I know why I put that slide there. So you see, this is the smallest type. So they had all this stuff in bigger type, and I said, we have these 17 different activities going on in Buffalo, which we've been doing for 5 years. Can we please have a link on the philosophy page? And after a lot of effort, they created this tiny link down here in small letters. And it's also not well designed to fit with the other link. It's that's unfair. But I can tell you the first time I gave a talk like this in October 2006, I received an email from a certain person who was at that time being paid by the philosophy department saying that I should immediately resign because I wasn't a philosopher anymore. I was getting paid as a member of the department. So, typical results of the founding of the new discipline. So the new discipline initially lacks sophistication. I've already confessed to that. It's dismissed as trivial. Clearly, most of what we've been talking about is trivial. It's hard work, but it's not transcendental ego in its self-constitution across infinite time. But it's also very well financed. So there is a lot of money in ontology, which is much, much greater than the money which is available to philosophers. And the conferences are already much larger than typical philosophy conferences. And this is at an early stage when the discipline still doesn't really exist. There is intensified international cooperation, so that I can testify that there is much more active cooperation between the existing small group of ontologists than there is between the much larger group of philosophers. And there is genuine cooperative work with deadlines, which philosophers don't really understand, clear stated goals, which is sort of alien to the tradition of philosophy, much shorter deadlines for publication than in philosophy. Now, why do you found a new discipline? Let's return to this question. They founded this discipline in part because they were being pushed out of philosophy because of ego-related jealousy, but they also founded a discipline because they needed trained psychologists, and they couldn't meet the needs of those trained psychologists within the then existing resources. Now, so therefore, the world's exploding need for trained ontologists, I think, cannot be met with the existing structures maintained by Department of Philosophy. I'll give you one story and then we'll stop the discussion. I was at a philosophical conference a couple of weeks ago. I don't normally go to philosophical conferences, as you can understand. And there was a very interesting talk by a former colleague of mine who is now a friend, but no longer a colleague because he's still a philosopher. And it was about some metaphysical question. And the metaphysical question was something like, what exists? Good question. And he was trying to find a list of categories. And he was aching and twisting and expressing pain because he couldn't find a complete list. And I put my hand up and I said, why don't you just find a new example, which you're really confident about, of entities or classes or universals or categories, which you know exist? You would have made some progress, that just the kind of progress that scientists make. And he didn't understand my question. He didn't understand why it could be valuable just to provide a list of a few good cases. See, he's a philosopher. He wanted a complete theory. The idea of doing what scientists do, which is trying to build knowledge, trying to build one's discipline incrementally, it didn't penetrate. He's a very clever man. He's also familiar with what I do, but still he didn't understand that there is a value to doing what he does in the incremental scientific way rather than in the mega ambitious philosophical way, which he's been trained in. And so long as we train philosophers to think that only complete, perfect, transcendentally, metaphysically elegant theories are of value, that as long as we train them to believe that, they will not be interested in pursuing careers doing this kind of work, even in spite of the fact that it would be both stimulating and also rewarding to be involved in something. So it has to be outside philosophy. So we're going to take over this building. All right, any questions?
I still would think that ontology needs a philosopher in the room to do anything at all.
A former philosopher.
Huh?
A former philosopher.
Because
people can do their bachelor's degree in a philosophy department, then they can do their graduate degree in an ontology department.
Because I strongly believe that psychology is like a tool for a philosopher, like a tool that a philosopher needs to arrive at different thoughts as to what is going on around the world. And if we don't have a philosopher that brings in ideas, logical ideas into the plate, what ideas is going to be there for an ontology to try and change into data and make it to be a useful.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying. The problem is that the reason why philosophers bring in those ideas is because they're trained to address very, very strange kinds of questions, like what is entailment, or what is time, or what is a system. No other scientific discipline is trained to ask those highly general kinds of questions. And to do ontology, you need people who are skilled raising those questions. The problem is that if people who raise those questions are raised with the expectations of the philosophical career as it exists now, they will not dirty their hands with questions like, what is a credit card number? That's the problem. And I know that this problem exists because I have hired people become ontologists within a philosophy department. They've accepted the job. And then as soon as they're presented with the kind of work that ontology involves, they suddenly declare an interest in metaphysics of possible worlds or the epistemology of a priori structures, a la 19th century something. They don't realize that there is something interesting that is not characterized by this philosophical
Maybe I should end this by saying that for every one philosopher, perhaps have 4 ontologies.
In the future, I think it will be that probably it will be I don't know, but for every one philosopher there are probably 10 neuroscientists. Oh yeah, probably you're about right. But who knows? We'll see. Come back in 10 years.
There should be that. What I'm trying to say in essence is, if 4 ontologists sit in the room, and if they're trying to put it together data and stuff like that, there has to be one philosopher in that room too to tell them that, okay, you guys are right on this.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. It's roughly that kind of affair which has to be brought into existence. The question is, how do you train the ontologist? How do you get people who are trained ontologists, given that there are in universities today no departments of ontology? Yeah.
I think there are 2 other areas from which you might recruit people for the Department of Ontology. And I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new. Data modeling, databases. I mean, I agree with you that computer systems, people generally think in algorithms and efficiency and storage structures and are willing to just do ad hoc methods for structuring the data. But database modeling, people, they do think about the same question. And the other group is classification theory, coming out of the information science tradition. And they both, I think, have something useful to contribute. So you want to follow them and make a coalition with them.
I would like it to be the case that both of those groups were cooperating successfully with others in the ontology world. I would like them to be involved. But again, I think there are disciplinary pressures afoot which make it hard for them to cooperate in a positive way. And I'll just give you one example of the kind of disciplinary pressures. In the classification systems world, in certain circles anyway, there is a very strong tendency to say that you shouldn't try to impose too systematic a logical structure on the controlled vocabularies that you develop as the basis for your classifications. This is true in medicine even. And that's because if you do impose too great a structure, and the people who are creating the data, the clinicians, will not recognize their own terms, and so they won't use the system, and so the system will be a waste of everybody's energy. So they are willing to compromise on structure in order to maximize the degree of warm, smiley faces on the side of the community of people whose words need to be somehow annotated. Now, I know that it is hard to create terminological regimentation, but I also know that it's been successfully done in certain circles in certain ways. Basically, it's a bad way if you try and make people change the way they speak, because they won't change the way they speak. But it's a good way if you make people accept that when published literature or databases are constructed, then terms from a regimented vocabulary should always be used, and that regimented vocabulary should have good logic structure. So this is the explanation, I think, for much of the success of the genome, that they managed to find a way of combining structure with regimentation with acceptance by the user. Now, as soon as information scientists, classification scientists come on board with that kind of approach, then I think they will make a contribution. But at the moment, they are resisting the needed structure. They're resisting the need for good definition. They're resisting the need for those kinds of things which will enable the right kinds of reasoning, or any kind of reasoning in the future. Yes?
The first question that we just had was about the relationship between having an ontologist with a philosopher around. So my question is, how would you design a curriculum such that you would have ontologically minded philosophers or philosophically minded ontologists? What sorts of, rather than having an undergraduate degree in philosophy and going on to graduate school, what sorts of philosophy do you think would be most important? Or how would you teach these philosophical skills in a manner that people attracted to computer science would be attracted to learning, and vice versa?
I wish I knew the answer to that question, because it's what it is that is a good way of training philosophers already is a question that I don't have a really good answer. I think my own preferred strategy would not be to work on the curriculum side. It would be to work on the incentives side. So my vision is that in the future, so we need to create a career track so that people who study philosophy will see that once they get their degree, if they do certain things which they need to work out for themselves, then they will be able to work for these kinds of companies or for these kinds of departments in other universities and get much more money than their mere philosopher colleagues. And that means that there needs to be there need to be contractual arrangements which enable that kind of career track to be constructed. We're working on it, but it's founding a new discipline involves treading on people's toes, irritating people, and a lot of hard work over a long time. And a lot of the attempts that we make along the way will fail.
Question that he asked. I believe train a philosopher better. Philosopher has to know more about human psychology. Has to know more about human psychology for a philosopher to be much effective along the line of ontologist. He has to have a solid foundation as to who human is, as to the system, as to the society that is even living in. A philosopher has to be put into categories. Has to be in terms of like a local philosopher as compared to a global philosopher. Because a local philosopher with psychology is going to build based on all the experiences that he had around him, as compared to a different philosopher that is on a seat to have much of a global perspective, much of a global experience.
Okay, so I think I agree with both of your comments, but they make me think of a third comment. So being an ontologist, you need to be a good psychologist, because part of your work, in my case, a large part of your work, involves arguing with people and persuading them to change their habits. Sometimes arguing with institutions and persuading them to exchange their structures. And to do that, you need to have some knowledge of human psychology and of the way egos work and so forth. I didn't claim to have a very good knowledge of human psychology, but I seem to be able to get my way many times. Secondly, I agree with you that philosophers need to stop thinking in this global, mega-oriented way and think more locally, not think about the nature of all being, but think about the nature of obligations. But then, on the other hand, I don't think that ontology should be local. Ontology has to be such that all the ontologies that different groups develop work well together, and that will be the topic of tomorrow's lectures for large. Anyone else? Some of these credit-worthy people want to...
I have a question about the term definition. Going back to the philosophical sense, and I'm still confused between metaphysics in philosophical sense and ontology in philosophical sense, especially in the universal aspect.
Good. So the term metaphysics was introduced by accident when people were compiling the works which we now think of as being the works of Aristotle. They collected all of those things which were about physics, and they called that collection the Physics. And then they compiled these other things which were about things like categories and sorts of things we were talking about this morning. And that was the book which came after the Physics. And after the Physics in Greek is metaphysics. And so metaphysics just means those things which Aristotle talked about after the Physics. Now, what he did talk about after the physics were things like the nature of being, the nature of categories, and so forth. And that's what metaphysics is all about. And the precise scope has changed over history. There's no one specific way of understanding what metaphysics means, but it means, roughly speaking, the study of the nature of being, or the study of the nature of being as being, whatever that means. Now, in 1604 or thereabouts, some philosophers in Germany who were writing in Latin, these were late scholastic philosophers, coined the term ontologia. And what they meant was metaphysics, or metaphysics in a somewhat more scientific sense, in the way that they understood science, somewhat more rational sense, but they meant metaphysics. Metaphysics is the logia of ontos, which means the science of being. And Kant and his followers were somewhat skeptical of metaphysics, and therefore this ontology activity in Germany fell by the wayside with the death of scholasticism, and it grew up again at various points, which I tried to illustrate this morning with Brentano and with the analytical metaphysics people in America. And then in biology and in computer science, people started talking about and doing ontology. And now gradually they didn't mean metaphysics anymore. They meant not the science of being in this global, highly ambitious, rather, they meant the study of the kinds of entities which there are in reality and of the relations between those entities in a somewhat scientific sense, but still highly general. So chemists study the study of the kinds of molecules or atoms. Philosophers study, delete that from the record. Ontologists study what is it to be made of matter, or what is it to be material? What is it to be a combination, a mixture in chemistry, for instance? These are ontological questions which are part and parcel of the work of creating these controlled, structured vocabularies for the sake of helping scientific data to be more successfully integrated. So gradually, my prediction is ontology in this sense will become more and more recognized as an independent activity, to the degree that institutes, teaching departments of philosophy will be founded in universities. And the first university to do that will corner the market for at least a few years, and maybe it will be Buffalo.
The way I kind of think of the relationship between philosophy and other sciences is that, or arts, is that other arts and sciences adopt a certain set of philosophical presuppositions and run with and them out, develop them. So if there's a disagreement within the science, you have a disagreement about the first principles of that science, potentially. And those could be resolved philosophically or maybe pragmatically, one might. So my question is, if ontology is a science that is separated from philosophy, then will there be ontologies that adopt different philosophical first principles for their science? So you might have conceptualist ontology and realist ontology.
That's a very good question. So there was a time when there were alternative physics. So there was the Germans in the Second World War developed Aryan physics, and they referred to Semitic physics. And some people talk about feminist physics. And clearly we don't want any of that. So if ontology is to be a science, then it has to be a unitary enterprise. There cannot be different ontologies. In that sense, there can be ontologies of molecules, of cells, and so on, but that's a different issue. So I believe that ontology will become a science only when there are methods, which will be empirical methods, which will ensure that there is convergence on single framework of ontology science, in just the same way that the physical methods of test hypothesis ensure that physics converges on one single physical representation of reality. Now, how we do that at the moment is somewhat, we're still working out how we do it. But I'm tempted to say that in certain fields of biology, anyway, I play a big role in determining how ontology evolves, just because I have the loudest voice. In purely acoustic terms. But that's clearly not a good method for for a discipline to become a well-entrenched part of the body of scientists.
That kind of leads into my concern that if it's not resolved philosophically, what other legitimate ways are there?
Yes, so it certainly can't be resolved philosophically. That would be a fallback. It has to be resolved in something like the following way. And I wish we had the resources to do these experiments, but we don't. You have a scientific problem. You have to understand, for instance, how to interpret a huge body of data about some disease, for instance, in terms of underlying genetic factors which are suspected as being involved in this. But maybe that some people, when they get this disease, die immediately, and other people are not affected at all. But you don't know why that is. And so you're trying to find what the genes are in virtue of which there is high susceptibility, particularly acute forms. But it's a real problem. And nowadays, one standard method for solving such problems is to take the data that you have, annotate it or study it using the gene ontology in order to determine, on the basis of all the other information which has been annotated using the gene ontology, which particular genes that you've identified as being involved in the disease processes are more expressed than usual or less expressed than usual, so that you can identify those genes which might be particularly involved in these kinds of differences. That's the standard methodology. Now, supposing that the gene ontology is built on the basis of a realist methodology like the one I've been expounding. And let's suppose that we had another gene ontology, this is the conceptualist gene ontology, for instance, SIGO, which is founded on a conceptualist methodology, which equally has 11 million annotations to roughly the same biomedical information. And then you would run exactly the same Go-based statistical tests over your data using the second ontology. And then you could compare empirically whether the realism-based Go or the conceptualist ego produced the best results. I can tell you now what the answer is, but that wouldn't actually count for very much. But that's the kind of empirical test I have in mind.
Seems like a very pragmatic test, and it makes me think of Shaler's account. They are actually motivated by values of utility and not really representing the way it is. But on the other hand, if it pragmatically works, somehow it's related to the way the real world is.
And that's where I rest my case. If one is working better than the other, that's because I think the one is a better representation, which means that the one gets closer to reality. That's, life is short. In this way, we get truth and utility in one vowels. Yes.
Do you think that if ontology becomes its own discipline, or
When?
I don't know when, but hopefully you know a little better than I do. But if you think that eventually, if it does, and do you think that it's eventually going to solve like the practical problems that are posed to it? And do you think that if it does solve these practical problems, that it could be subsumed back into philosophy?
No, once it's out, it's out. You can't go back. You can't go back into the mothership. Once you're an adult, it's hard to fit into the womb.
I know, but do you think that ontology would eventually reach a point where the practical problems that it faces are going to be more or less able to be solved by the methods that you guys have come up with? And if it does, then it seems like you guys are just left with the theoretical problems that we dealing with in philosophy.
I think that the way that it's clear that science is going to involve more and more the use of computers to organize it. It's clear that almost every human act, medicine, government, business, is going to involve more and more the use of computers to organize data. I think, I've thought this for 35 years, and only in the last 3 years have I really begun to realize how true this is. That the only hope we have, if computers are going to manage data in any sensible way, is something like ontology, in something like the way I've been describing. I think it's the only hope. I'm not saying it's a reasonable hope, but it's the best hope, one best hope. Now, if that's the case, because of this constant increase, there'll be a constant increase in the need for ontologists. And eventually universities will recognize that need. And it maybe takes us another 5 generations before they finally realize that they need to put them outside computer science. We'll see. We're living in interesting times. Okay, this will be the final question for today.
I'm a grad student in the library science program, and kind of the way we look at things is librarians or information professionals, or whatever you want to call us, we're more user-oriented, while programmers, they make the information retrieval systems. They're kind of the back end, and the users never see these. We're kind of a go-between users and programmers, and I wonder where you see ontologists fitting into that continuum, if they do.
I'm tempted to say that we will usurp your role.
That's why I'm here.
Well, then we can come to some happy agreement. But I think that there will in the future be more and more ontological work in libraries. You want to have the last question? Well, stand up then.
It's not a question, it's a comment, I think. There you are wrong. I think that librarians should remain closer to language than ontologists should. So I think that the role will always be different.
So either that or people start to talk proper.
But they will not talk in this kind of
okay, then it's that you're right.
predicate logic that you want to express yourself for good reasons, right? That's
You're almost certainly right. Yes.